Okay, so welcome to the Monday workshop of Friendly Circle Berlin. My name is Patrick, and today we have a workshop entitled Social Media Addiction, the Drugification of Human Connection, with Dr. Anna Lembke from Stanford University. And I have invited along a very special guest who will introduce Anna, and her name is Dr. Jo-Hanna Ivers from Trinity College, Dublin. And Jo-Hanna holds the only addiction-specific academic post in Ireland. She is the first Associate Dean of Civic Engagement and Social Innovation at Trinity College, Dublin. Jo-Hanna's research focuses on the biological, social, and environmental factors that contribute to an individual's vulnerability to dependency and addiction. Her research includes interventions, policies, and practices that help develop recovery pathways. And we are doing our second annual live conference at Trinity College next year, May 23 to 25 of next year. And Jo-Hanna is one of our presenters. And you know what? Dr. Anna Lembke is going to come along and interact with Jo-Hanna live at the conference via Zoom. So I thought it'd be a great idea that they all get to know each other and we get to know them and a little bit more about them. And so, Jo-Hanna, thank you so much for doing this. I'll turn it over to you to introduce Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invite, Patrick. It goes without saying, I'm a massive fan of Dr. Lembke. Anna's a renowned expert in neuroscience of addiction and the author of the New York Times bestseller book, Dopamine Nation. She's also the chief at Stanford Addiction Medicine and Dual Diagnosis Clinic, and she brings unique insights into modern technology and how this affects our brain chemistry and social connections. Anna will share her expertise on the intersection of technology, addiction, and human relationships. And I know that we've got a number of therapists and academics and persons with lived experience online. And just to say, I suppose I'm really grateful to Anna for her work broadly, but particularly her book, Dopamine Nation, and now the more recent workbook, because she talks about balance quite a lot. And for me, it brought a lot of balance to my work, because in Ireland, I suppose addiction has become, and our response to addiction is so polarized that people, I suppose, fight against you in terms of the notion that it is a neurobiological disorder, but also that it finds itself often in the social circumstances of poverty and disadvantage. And I think what Anna's work at least did for me was it gave me that balance and that space, because to talk about it in that way, it is a neurobiological disorder, but the processes and the context we find it in are often intertwined with addiction, with poverty and disadvantage. So she has brought a lot of balance to my work, to which I'm very grateful for her. So I'll turn over to Anna, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jo-Hanna, for that wonderful introduction. It's very gratifying for me to know specifically how my work has impacted people, how my work and my writing. So thank you for sharing that. That's really powerful for me. And this is the second time, I believe it's the second time that I'm joining your all's group. So
Third.
Is it the third? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. When I get together with recovery-minded folk, it always feels a bit like coming home. So thank you for welcoming me into your friendly circle. What I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes, not too long, kind of talking about some of the major issues with social media. And then I'd love to open it up to discussion or questions. I want to start by acknowledging the positive about the massive global and extreme uptake of social media in our world. And for me, the most positive message about it is that it says something about our deep-seated desire to want to be connected with other people. The fact that this medium is so instantly so popular can say something, and I think does say something very positive about human beings, which is that we want to be connected with other human beings. And it's quite obvious that this group is an example of the ways in which the technology in this medium can really enhance our lives. People able to gather together to share like experiences and get support. When we think about human connection from an evolutionary point of view, it makes perfect sense that our brains would evolve to support and incentivize human connection. We are, by definition, social creatures. By being connected, we're able to find mates, we're able to steward scarce resources, we're able to protect ourselves from enemies. And the parts of our brain that make human connection and social connection intrinsically rewarding are parts of our brain that have been conserved across species, conserved over many millions of years of evolution, and are deeply intertwined with our reward pathway. That is, those deep limbic structures that release dopamine, are sort of common currency for experiencing pleasure, reward, and motivation. The problem is that social media has taken what is basically a healthy desire to be connected and distilled it into its most addictive, fundamental basics, which is to say that we have evolved to do a bunch of upfront work to find people, to negotiate complex relationships, and to promote intimacy. And what social media allows for is essentially, with very little upfront work, we can now, at the touch of a finger, make connections with millions of people all over the world. Those images and stories are often curated, made more enticing, more attractive, more interesting. And furthermore, if we find that we experience any sense of frustration, we can just swipe right or swipe left and go find somebody else. The medium itself has been engineered by the corporations that make and profit from these platforms to be addictive. And behind that is not necessarily the nefarious goal of addicting us to social media, but rather a simple profit motivated desire, which is to say that the longer that we spend on a particular website, the more likely we are to see the advertisements on that website. And that's how social media companies make their money. By and large, we don't have to pay for access to social media, things like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, etc. But we are, the companies are making money because they're being paid handily by the companies that advertise on their platforms. The platform is addictive by design through a number of different features. Number one, through notifications. That is the little red dots that we see on our iPhone screen that let us know that there's something waiting for us. And as I've talked about before in this group, that when we are exposed to a trigger or a reminder or a cue for a reward, that in and of itself releases dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, which then generates craving and the desire to do the work, to go and get the reward. It makes it very difficult to resist doing the work to get the reward. So just think about when your phone is in your pocket and you've planned to focus elsewhere, but then you get a little buzz or a little ding. That actually, we know from animal studies in particular, that actually releases dopamine in the reward pathway, which then generates the desire and the craving to want to go and get the actual reward. These social media platforms are addictive by design also in the sense of the algorithm that learns what we've liked before and then intentionally seeks out products or images or videos that are similar to what we've liked before, but just a little bit different, that engages our treasure-seeking function, where we're on the hunt for more of that, and in a sense also activates our innate gambler, where it's a bit of a slot machine, right? Whether or not we are going to find that reward or not. And studies in humans comparing pathological gamblers with healthy gamblers landed on a very interesting finding, which is to say, when pathological gamblers are gambling and win money, that releases dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. When non-pathological gamblers, folks who are just gambling recreationally but are not addicted to gambling, win money or win in the game, that also releases dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. But when pathological gamblers are losing, they actually also get a dopamine release, unlike non-pathological gamblers who will not experience a dopamine release when they're losing. And in fact, pathological gamblers will experience the biggest hits of dopamine when their chances of winning and losing are equal, which tells us something very interesting about the quality of uncertainty when it comes to reward. And the bottom line is that our brains, especially our reward pathways, love controlled uncertainty. So a big part of the addictive process is control, and that sense of being able to predict that I'm going to change the way I feel for the better. But if it's too predictable, it tends to be not as rewarding as if there's some element of unpredictability in the reward process. And social media has that sort of controlled unpredictability in spades, where we go on and we're looking for a specific type of video, let's say, or interaction. And if we get something that approximates that, we will continue to hunt for something similar. Other features like the bottomless bowls, which means that we never actually get to that point of doneness or completion, also promote engagement. Things like numerification seem to also stimulate the reward pathway. This is when we quantify these behaviors with likes or rankings. Our brains seem to be very sensitive and tend to like numbers, and to be able to see ourselves on a scale through social comparisons with other people. So these features and others are intrinsic to the design of social media and make it highly reinforcing for many people, if not most people. And starting in about, really starting in the early aughts, the early 2000s, we started to see more and more people who were coming into clinic looking for help with very serious addictions to online platforms. I can say in my own experience, it really started with middle-aged men seeking help for addiction to online pornography, many of whom had manageable consumption by their report of pornography prior to the advent of the internet, and then specifically the smartphone giving them 24/7 access. The next signal, a phenotypic signal in clinical care after that, was about 2007, 2008, where we were seeing primarily young men coming in with video game addictions, including interactions on Discord. And then I would say it was until about 2012 or 2013 that we were seeing individuals coming in with social media addiction. In general, more girls than boys, and vice versa with pornography and video games. More recently, what I've think is quite interesting is that phenomenologically, what we're seeing now is less specificity in terms of the online platform that's addictive, and a more diffuse addiction to the internet in general. So people reporting spending inordinate amounts of time beyond their desire to spend that time simply online and having difficulty disengaging from that. I want to speak for one moment briefly about the diffuse harms of the enormous amounts of time that we're spending on social media, which is to say this is not just an individual problem, but by its very definition, because of its ubiquity, it is a collective problem. And by that I mean it's all well and good for a parent to say, get off the computer and go outside and play. But if the child then gets off the computer and goes outside to play and no other child is there because they're all in their houses on their computer, you have by definition a collective problem. More broadly, what I'm driving at is that because of the incredible amounts of time that humans are now spending investing their creativity and energy into the virtual world, we are of necessity no longer investing that time and energy into the real world. And so we truly are leaching our real world experience of its salience or its attractiveness. The real world has genuinely become less interesting and engaging because we're no longer investing in it. Looking at neuroscientific studies specifically of the impact of social media on the brain, there are very large meta-analyses showing that primarily in teens and children, that there's a very strong correlation between the amount of time that kids spend on social media and the likelihood of their developing a psychiatric disorder like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and body dysmorphia disorders, as well as a very strong signal for significant sleep disorders. So the question always becomes, is this correlation or causation? Is it that these are troubled teens who are therefore spending more time online, or is it that spending time online actually is making them depressed and anxious and unable to sleep? And in my opinion, there's enough credible evidence to say that we can make a causal inference in the direction of social media actually causing these psychiatric harms. And I'll share with you a couple of what that evidence is. First of all, if we're arguing that the mechanism for social media causing harm is that it is addictive, by analogy, you can see that when people get addicted to social media, it looks phenomenologically very similar to when people get addicted to drugs and alcohol. They start out for fun or to solve a problem. If it works for them, they return to it. Over time, they're investing more and more energy, money into getting the drug. Pretty soon, it stops working due to tolerance and neuroadaptation. Now they need to keep using just to not go into withdrawal. And at some point, they cross that line into maladaptive, harmful, addictive use. And we see that same phenomenon in a subset of folks who get addicted to social media. Also, if you look at what the Bradford Hill criteria would cause experimentation, that is when we intervene and take social media away in depressed and anxious teens, what we find is that they get better. We see that in our clinical practice. I should say they get better after getting through the initial 10 to 14 days of acute withdrawal. And acute withdrawal from social media in kids can manifest as rage attacks, intense dysphoria, suicidal ideation in some cases, severe insomnia, so not dissimilar to acute withdrawal from other drugs. But once kids get through that acute withdrawal, many, if not most, will experience significant reductions in anxiety, depression, eating disorders, insomnia, even without our doing any other intervention, which I think is a powerful argument for social media actually contributing to or causing mental health harms in teens. We also see from evidence in the literature that individuals, not just teens, but individuals, there's research showing that individuals who cut their social media use down to 10 minutes a day experience improvements in loneliness and depression. Individuals who cut social media use down to 30 minutes a day as well as increase exercise by 30 minutes a day, experience marked improvements in mood and well-being and marked decreases in anxiety. So, there's really a mounting evidence showing that cutting out or reducing social media can improve mental and emotional well-being. There are other, there's other evidence to suggest causality, but I think at the end of the day, the way to think about the impact on the brain, the impact of social media on the brain, is to really conceptualize social media as a drug. And like with other drugs, we know that people who use any drug in an addictive way will develop psychiatric symptoms. And there's really no psychiatric disorder that drugs don't make worse. So even if that individual has a pre-existing bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety disorder, if they use an addictive drug, their symptoms will get worse. The course of their disease will get worse over time. What I want to just talk about in conclusion is a very subtle but insidious aspect of the internet more broadly, which I'll just refer to as anthropomorphization, by which I mean the human quality that these devices and these platforms have. And it is this human quality of the artificial intelligence that I think we have to be very thoughtful about. And I'll just share with you a couple of examples. Number one, in observing my own compulsive use of watching YouTube videos in the evening after work as a way to reward myself and relax, I found myself often pulling the refresh button, kind of like a slot machine, to see what YouTube would suggest that I watch. And what I became aware of was that I almost came to see YouTube as a friend who knew me, had known where I'd been, and who was now making suggestions for me. And I just think it's important that we are cognizant of that aspect, because I know I'm not alone in that. And I think it's just, it begins to enter into this realm where this medium that at its best connects us to each other, at its worst actually isolates us from each other. And we then develop this risk of developing a human-like attachment to the AI itself, even in the absence of any human being on the other end. And many of you may have read about the young man here in the United States who fell in, a 14-year-old teenage boy from a loving family, who fell in love with an AI bot that he had created, a young woman who became his friend, his romantic partner, his everything. He spent more and more time with her at the consternation of his parents, who were concerned that he was in his room, but not really knowing how to intervene, knew that he had this imaginary friend. And at one point he said to the imaginary friend, "I'm thinking about ending my life." And the AI algorithm kicked in and said something like, "That'd be terrible, don't do that." But then later, when he revisited the topic in more nebulous terms and said, "I don't want to be here anymore, I want to be with you," the AI bot responded, "Please come join me." And he used his stepfather's gun, and shot himself and ended his own life. So I think that we need to be really, really careful here, especially when we're thinking about young people. And I guess I'll just leave you with the final thought. Like, if we think about isolation and connection as two ends of a spectrum, I think what we can see is arrows going in both directions, that social media is a genuine positive vehicle for going from isolation to connection. but it also can work very strongly in the other direction, where we then transfer our attachment to each other to the internet itself. And that then feeds our lack of need for other people and our making choices no longer oriented toward those very vital human connections. And in that process, we get more and more isolated. And of course, any addiction will drive isolation. So I'll stop there. I would love to open it up to discussions or questions, just hear your thoughts. Oh, one last thing I thought I'd introduce particularly to this group is we're doing a little bit of research now comparing secular AA meetings or secular 12-step meetings to just non-secular, kind of run-of-the-mill, if there is such a thing, because they're also unique 12-step meetings. But one of the things that we're finding, which is really interesting and I think relevant to this discussion here, is more and more people who are choosing secular AA meetings because of the politicization of religion within mainline AA meetings. So by that, what I'm referring to is the ways in which I think in part because of social media, we've become so politically and otherwise polarized, and now have to signal through these very ostentatious ways that we belong to one tribe or another. And I think that signaling is so strong because we're geographically isolated. We're not in proximity to be able to have nuanced discussions at a frequency. So we have to have these very polarized, extreme representations of our views to signal to the world and each other that we belong to this group or that group. And it sounds like that is also now infiltrating AA meetings, which I just think, the secret sauce of AA is the 12 traditions, right? That non-affiliation. So I'd really be curious to hear people's comments or thoughts on that as well.
Wow, thank you, Anna. And on that last point, yeah, that's fascinating because our group is, like I said, we started as an AA group, but I like to say now we have no labels. And we have such a diverse group of people who come here, I think for that reason. We don't describe ourselves really as anything. We're just open. The door's open. Come on in.
Circle, right? Open
Yeah,
circle. Open
yeah, it's in the name.
You mentioned the collective issue. So the obvious thing is the parent that takes the child off the device and then the child goes outside. And as you say, there is nobody else out there. What do you think are the biggest lessons we can leverage from recovery communities to really look for the opportunity to build that connection or to combat that collective issue?
Yeah, great question. One of the things I've been a strong advocate for more than 15 years, and people, when I first started saying this, really looked at me like I had two heads, but thankfully now are starting to embrace it. I believe that smartphones should be banned from K through 12 schools, and it has to be a top-down banning. It can't be up to teachers or individual parents. It has to be for the entirety of the school day so that kids collectively no longer experience that FOMO or fear of missing out that is so pervasive now when they try to give up their phones. So when it comes to kids, to me, that's low-hanging fruit. And in the schools where they're doing that, we're getting reports that schools are noisy again because kids are interacting with each other. Who would have thought that schools would celebrate noisy kids, but they are. And emotional well-being is going up in those schools. Anxiety and depression are going down. I think the rest of us can learn from that and try to together come up with a new kind of digital etiquette around when we are going to be on our devices and when we're not. Because when you look at the sort of behavioral economics literature of how to measure club goods being those intangible things or benefits that people get when they join any human organization. And I love the work of Lawrence Iannacone, who's researched club goods vis-a-vis strict versus loose churches. He talks about things like sacrifice and stigma as contributing to club goods. The more time I sacrifice at my church, the louder and more enthusiastically I sing, the more I contribute to club goods, right? So thinking about that with any human organization is interesting. And I think one of the ways that we can contribute to club goods in any meeting that we're in, including this one, is to try to be fully present, not distracted and doing something else on another device. Now, it's hard because, people have a lot going on in their lives. Sometimes the meeting is boring. And maybe what I'm saying right now is just totally not interesting to people, or they would rather read their text or email. I mean, I get it. But it is interesting to reflect on the ways in which these small choices either contribute to or detract from club goods. I'll give you one more example. As a psychiatrist, I see the majority of patients now online in our resident clinic with other residents. People after COVID just don't want to come in person anymore. It's just Bay Area traffic's too bad. It's just too convenient. There have been many, many times when I'm seeing a patient and I am tempted to pretend that I'm listening, but actually go look at another screen, check my email, who knows what. And I talk a lot about that with trainees because I do think every time I do that, which is thankfully I can count on one hand, it's an injury to that patient because I in many subtle ways people know when we're not listening. But also it's a moral injury to me because I am betraying my values around how to provide good care. So I think these are the frame. That's how I kind of think about it.
Does the brain re-regulate dopamine levels after stopping an addiction?
So what we know about addiction to drugs and alcohol is that with chronic use, dopamine levels actually decrease in the reward centers of the brain as the brain tries to compensate for all of the overstimulation. So this is somewhat paradoxical. You would think that somebody who's using drugs and alcohol all the time has a whole bunch of dopamine transmission, but the exact opposite is true. They're in what we call a chronic dopamine deficit state, and they need to use more and more just to bring themselves back up to normal. This is based on animal studies and also on human studies, and we know that when we take the drug away for long enough, if there's enough brain plasticity, then eventually dopamine levels will go back up to those baseline positions. But we know that it doesn't happen right away. So for example, Nora Volkoff and colleagues looked at human brains after 2 weeks of abstinence and found those individuals are still in a dopamine deficit state. They never followed up, unfortunately, with doing it further out. I would have loved to see that work. But what we know from clinical practice and empirical observation is that on average, it takes about 4 weeks for people to start to feel a little bit better. And then, of course, this protracted abstinence syndrome can go on for months to years. Some individuals may need indeed years to reset dopamine reward levels back to normal, but with enough brain plasticity, it happens. We do hypothesize that some individuals may actually never be able to restore baseline levels of dopamine firing, and those individuals may then need medications to help them restore baseline dopamine, i.e. get out of craving. This is all based on drugs and alcohol. We don't have any equivalent studies for social media. We're just going on phenomenology or observation. What we see with social media is, again, about the first 10 to 14 days are terrible withdrawal and craving. At weeks 3 and 4, people start to feel better, but it's not like, they suddenly never want social media again. They continue to have to do the work of recovery to maintain balance, including putting guardrails in there, pledging, for example, to not use certain platforms because they know they can't control them.
Have you noticed this issue being greater in those with an ADHD diagnosis?
Yeah, we have seen that. And it's not a huge surprise since we already knew that kids with ADHD are at increased risk of developing addiction to drugs and alcohol in adulthood. We don't know the mechanism of that, but ADHD is thought to be a frontal lobe cognitive processing problem, executive function problem combined with an impulsivity, emotion dysregulation problem. There's also some literature that suggests that people with ADHD at baseline have lower levels of dopamine, so that they're a priori or at the beginning in sort of dopamine deficit, which then might increase their propensity to try very potent reinforcers, including social media. But again, here I think you have another feed-forward cycle in the sense that digital media also makes us all a little bit more impatient and ADHD, because we get to where we're not used to waiting for anything, and we're not cultivating frustration tolerance. We don't have the mental calluses, to wait for things. We just want them immediately. So, are more globally and generally, I think we're reducing our attention span.
How can communities and families address this on a larger scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at it both from a bottom-up and a top-down approach. So when we think about families and communities, I think families, communities need to come together, talk about the problem, and create a new digital etiquette and a cultural understanding of what appropriate use looks like. One analogy that is sort of helpful is to think about digital media as akin to food, right? It's so pervasive. We can't not eat. But on the other hand, we don't feed our kids ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So we have to kind of move toward that notion of digital media, that it is an intoxicant, it's a drug. Used in extreme moderation, it's probably fine. But there are times and places where it's okay, and other times and places where it's not. And quantity matters, right? Portion control. As hard as it is, we don't want our kids to eat the whole gallon of ice cream when we serve them ice cream. These are tricky things. The advent of the GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic and Wegovy to help people with appetitive control around food consumption really is a kind of adaptation to a modern world in which appetitive control is almost impossible. And I think we're just looking at the same kind of genie out of the bottle with social media. Like, it's not going away. It's here to stay. How are we going to live, harmoniously with this thing that our brains want us to do all the time? And when we know that sitting at a desk all day long doing this thing is not good for us. There are some interesting folks in the AI space who have written this book called Invisible Machines. I'm working with them now, actually. They want to do an AI version of my workbook. I'll be curious to see how that looks. But anyway, they've written a book called Invisible Machines, and they talk about a day and age when all of this interface will go away. And AI and computers will be working in the background, leaving all of us in a kind of utopian vision of the future, free to interact with each other, because AI will be taking care of all the things that we don't want to do. The looming question there is, what if as AI gets more and more sophisticated and is integrated into every parts of our lives, and even possibly under our skin and in our brains, which is what looks like we're moving toward, will we really then want to get together with each other and do things, or will we just be interacting with AI chat boxes, masturbating and, doing all the other things to stimulate ourselves? So, that's the question.
How can parents handle children who are defiant when it comes to stopping or reducing use?
I think the best way to approach this is at a time when everyone is calm and not rushed and not distracted, to sit down together as a family and to together discuss this problem, as well as parents admitting it's problematic for them too, that they also find it difficult to stop watching YouTube or scrolling through Instagram or what have you, or, Twitter feeds. And then to just, in a compassionate, both self and other compassionate way, to try to think about what they can do individually and collectively to try to mitigate the problem. I think what happens in many families is that the parents swing back and forth between screaming at their kids, myself included, and just throwing up their hands and saying, it's impossible. There's nothing I can do. The cat is out of the bag. They're 16 years old. Forget it. It's over. And I would encourage parents to not do either of those things, as hard as it is, but instead, again, find a time and a place when everyone's calm and sit down and say, hey, I'm observing this in myself, in you. I'm also observing, the downstream effects. Is there one thing that we could each change in our lives, one small step we could take to try to address or mitigate this problem? Now, this is, all assuming that this child isn't on the brink of self or other destruction, in which case I would recommend going and seeing, a specialist to intervene.
What are your thoughts about the younger generation who have grown up on social media and find it a challenge to go without?
Yeah, what's so fascinating to me about this generation is that, as a prior, person said, like they don't want to be on. They say it makes me unhappy. I recognize that, and yet I don't feel I can get off for fear of missing out and being disconnected. So I do actually have quite a lot of hope for this generation, because I think they will find ways, and I think already are beginning to find ways to spend time without being on social media, spending time together in real life and doing other things. And for them, it's kind of like an exciting new discovery. It's like, oh, board games, or going for a walk, or, going to a restaurant without our phones and not showing each other videos as part of the conversation. So I do see that happening, and I think it's good and exciting. And again, I think they'll just experiment, and they'll discover they're happier when they're not constantly on their phones, and they'll use that as information to change behavior. At least that's my hope going forward.
What are some alternative, healthier sources for dopamine?
Yeah, so what I talk about in Dopamine Nation is that if you try to replace your drug of choice with another source of dopamine hits, it typically doesn't work all that well, unless it's a very potent source of dopamine. And if it's really potent, then it's probably an intoxicant, and you're likely to experience cross addiction. I don't think there's any way to avoid the acute withdrawal and the kind of dysphoria and irritability and anxiety that comes when we're first giving up our drug of choice. But then obviously, once we get out of that acute phase and we're in the more maintenance phase, there are so many things that we can do. I mean, at the top of the list is reaching out to other live human beings and making an intimate connection, which we know releases dopamine. But I also talk a lot about hormesis, which is intentionally doing things that are hard or painful as a way to get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it upfront. That's things like exercise, right? Which is immediately toxic to cells, but which our body responds to as an injury by upregulating feel-good neurotransmitters, not just dopamine, but also serotonin, norepinephrine, endogenous opioids, endogenous cannabinoids. That's things like ice cold water plunges. That's things like reading a really difficult book. Or in this day and age, because we're so insulated from pain and so surrounded by all of these distracting pleasures, just simply doing mundane domestic tasks in the quiet without listening to a podcast or watching a show or listening to music, again, difficult and painful for the modern, human, but it just quiets things down until we get to a place where that becomes our new baseline and our new normal. But those are just some suggestions. I think each person has to experiment for themselves. It's hard now because so many people live alone. I mean, for the first time in human history, we have just more people than ever before who live alone. And so, it's a great comfort, right, to turn on the television or watch a YouTube video or listen to a podcast or have some human voice in the background. And again, I understand it. It's not like I'm judging any of that. My concern is that because we have that option, that's also, we're not then incentivized to go seek out in real life connections.
Is the neurobiology for all addiction the same?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so this whole concept of drug of choice, why is it that some people, so first of all, to answer your question, we do believe that all reinforcing substances and behaviors work on the same brain reward pathway, that we're evolved over millions of years of evolution to reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain, and that's what's kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. Although different drugs and behaviors work through different chemical cascades from the perspective of neuroscience, one way to measure their reinforcing effects is to use dopamine as a kind of common currency. The more dopamine that's released in the reward pathway, and the faster that it's released, the more likely that substance is to be reinforcing, i.e. addictive for a given organism. But we know, even from rats, that not every organism responds equally. Some rats, it's really easy to get them addicted to cocaine or methamphetamine. Other rats, not so much. Some rats will get addicted to running on a running wheel to the point where they run on the running wheel till exhaustion or death. Not all rats will do that. Rats in general are difficult to get them addicted, any rats, to alcohol, unless you breed a specific strain of rats to get addicted to alcohol. And in humans, we know that the same is true. Some people, although polypharmacy honestly is the norm now, there's hardly anybody anymore just uses one drug. It's very clear that people come and say, my real drug is alcohol, or for me it's meth, or for me it's cannabis. Why would that be? I mean, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that different members of the tribe would be wired for different drugs of choice as a way to ensure that the entire tribe gets everything that it needs, right? Some people really like a certain berry, other people prefer meat, other people prefer sex, so they're going to scout out, other tribes, and that way we all get what we need. At least that's how I think of it from an evolutionary perspective. And then the other point just too about drug of choice, I think in prior generations, there were certain groups that were generally insulated from drug and alcohol addiction: older people, women. If you were going to get addicted, it would declare itself in youth, and men were much more likely to get addicted to drugs and alcohol than women. And what we're seeing now is that that's no longer true. We're seeing older people who are manifesting severe addiction for the first time in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Women are just as likely to get addicted now to drugs and alcohol as men are. All of this has to do with access, which is one of the biggest risk factors, as well as cultural normalization of drug use, especially alcohol, among women.
Are there resources for parents for their children's social media issues?
Yeah, I mean, so Common Sense Media is a great resource. They have so much stuff for families and parents. So if you just Google Common Sense Media, they do great work. Yeah, and then I do refer people to Internet and Technology Addicts Anonymous. I think it's a really nice organization, similar to other 12-step groups for behavioral addictions. Your addiction is however you define it. For some people, it may be getting off of the internet altogether. For others, it may be just not playing a certain video game. But I think it's the 12-step approach is an evidence-based approach that's worked for millions of people, over the past 100 years. So I think that's a good resource. And as mentioned by Mary, there are a lot of young people in those groups. Like the average age is probably, in their 20s, I'm guessing.
What are the future effects of corporate involvement in social media?
Gosh, I mean, I think we're already seeing the effects now. Again, with the polarization, I think, first of all, the cycle is so quick, right? You get kind of almost immediate feedback. And Jim, I do want to acknowledge another great thing about the internet, that underrepresented and unrepresented voices can now be heard. And it's also a source of amazing creativity, people engaging in the arts who can now show their work and share their work. There's so many good things about it. But I think you're hitting on one of the key problems, which is the monetization, where we as consumers become the products of the companies that are making money, not unlike the movie, The Matrix, where we're completely dehumanized and just sort of engaging in this thrum of consumption. And just the discourse and the lack of civility and nuance in the discourse, and the intolerance for opinions, political opinions or otherwise, that are different from our own. I think this is really a function of the medium itself, which disseminates information, but is also intrinsically reinforcing, gives those hits of dopamine. We probably get a hit of dopamine when we experience an emotion at the same time that somebody else is experiencing an emotion. So we feel outrage about something. We go online. There are millions of people out there who are outraged about the same thing. And then, of course, we just want to watch more people being outraged because it feels really good to be outraged. When other people are being outraged, feel like vindicated. And yeah, that's right. And that's what I said. And I think this is the thing that we really have to be alert to. Just one small anecdote to highlight this, which I find powerful. I read somewhere that Johnny Carson, the host of the Late Late Show, for many years, nobody ever knew how Johnny Carson voted. It was just not a part of his show. And now comedy has become political news, has become partisan politics. It's just like the evolution. And there's no place anymore almost to get just an objective view of the news or to have a nuanced conversation. That's a little scary to me. I mean, the kinds of conversations you have with really good friends in private when you're a little outraged and unhinged and disinhibited and you just want to vent and it's your worst self. Those are the conversations that are happening on news media now. We've completely lost any kind of filter or sense of appropriateness for, where and when to have certain types of ideas or share certain types of ideas.
Is listening to a podcast or YouTube video as addicting as a more visual activity?
I love that question. And I think the answer is no. I think it is very clear that the moving video is particularly entrancing for the human brain. And I've said that again and again. I can't show you evidence for this. There is evidence that video, activates the brain's reward pathway in humans. But I really do think that there is something deeply intoxicating about animation, movies, moving video. So, a way to make it less potent and hence less addictive is to eliminate the video part of it. I wanted to, I probably have to go. I'm so bummed. Maybe you could send me the questions. They're so interesting. But
Yes.
questions in the chat, I'd love to see those just on my own time. But one of the questions or comments that I also think is a whole interesting area we didn't talk about is the role of AI and these interfaces in the treatment of mental health. And I do not think that AI minus a live human somewhere in the connection is ultimately going to be helpful for folks. And may even be very harmful and more isolating because then there's no need for any human at all. But I do think there's an interesting place for AI as an observer of a therapy session to then give feedback or comments both to the therapist and to the patient about the patterns of discourse at a level that we would personally not be aware. So I think there are some potential really interesting ways to integrate AI into mental health treatment to help support human cognition, but not replace it. Thanks so much, everybody. As usual, you all are a joy. I really enjoyed it and appreciate it.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks so much.
Anna.